Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Look, Gavin, I understand that you're worried about being deported, but coming in here wearing a MAGA hat and gold Trump sneakers is going to get you violently deported from your job. Ass.
The following podcast contains...
You can't say goddamn on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
explicit language.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you thought things were just gonna get better after they got that weird? Oh, come on, what the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode number 479, the One World in Disharmony edition of the show. It's the finale of Winter Series 2025, and we're talking about how Y2K is still influencing society today, and don't feel too good about it. Stay tuned. The What the Hell Are You Thinking podcast is brought to you by The Connect, the guy in your cell block who can get stuff for you. As we're Claude screaming into 4 years of authoritarian rule, The Connect wants you to know we can get it for you. The Connect can get pretty much anything you need on the cell block. Smokes, drugs, USB drives with the latest NFL games and podcasts, a can of Spam, all the things that might make life in the camps a little more livable. The Connect knows which guards are cool and which guards are dickheads but can be bought, because that is The Connect specialty. So if you find yourself sitting in a squalid prison camp in middle America with that thing you posted on Blue Sky, The Connect can get you stuff. The Connect, you want stuff, so check with The Connect.
It's hard to fathom just how much the world has changed 20 years after Y2K.
I'm ready! I'm ready!
I think the biggest existential threat today is climate change.
These problems aren't all new.
There's always the threat of a new and emerging epidemic.
Can the lessons of Y2K help us figure out the problems of today?
Y2K is an example of a future problem that we're aware of today. And we have all types of those around.
Tonight we celebrate
Y2K. Y2K.
The ticking digital time bomb.
A 2-digit change in the date.
The first half of 2020 has rocked the world. Citizens across the globe are desperate for solutions. From climate change.
The climate crisis is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and yet it has been ignored for decades.
To the coronavirus.
The virus situation that we have right now. The experts are telling us this is what you need to do. The politicians are ignoring them.
I've probably told you all this story before.
Many, many times.
But it's content, so I'm going to tell it again. When I was a little kid, maybe 5 or 6, my mom told me about my brother, Fred. Also, just as a quick aside, Fred Bledsoe. Wow, rough name, buddy. Now, I had recently been assigned a baby sister.
You didn't ask for, and you don't want it.
So I knew that there was a possibility of more than one child in a family, but I couldn't help but notice that Fred wasn't around. Never came down to dinner. He didn't seem to have any toys. There were no photos of a boy that looked like me but wasn't me. So naturally, I began to develop questions like,
Where's Fred?
That is when my mother, the woman who gave birth to me and presumably loved me with all of her heart, looked me dead in the eye and lied to me. She told me that Fred
is a very naughty boy.
And because he was so naughty, my parents had no other choice but to take Fred to the Great Smoky Mountains and leave him with the Bears. The Bears. Not the Chicago football team, but the actual, Ursine Bears. Now, even in my youthful naivete, I found this to be
unlikely.
But I couldn't just come out and call my mother a liar. I needed some kind of proof, so I began my own little investigation into this alleged Fred. I queried my father, who sadly confirmed that yes, Fred had been a bad boy and was now living with an Ursine family somewhere outside of Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Unsatisfied with this answer, I expanded my inquiry to my aunts, my mother's sister's people, who had no reason to lie to me, and each and every one of them assumed the same sad expression and lied to me with something like, poor Fred, he just wouldn't listen. And so, with confirmation from multiple sources, I had no choice but to believe that my parents had had a child prior to me and left him in the woods with the bears because he was a very naughty boy. This instantly raised the question in my tiny mind that with the arrival of this new child in the family, a girl, perhaps they had grown tired of my behavior, and I was about to be consigned to the woods with my older brother and his new bear family. Some months later, the family took a little trip to the smoking. I, sitting in the back seat as we approached them, burst into tears begging my parents not to leave me like they did Fred. They, watching me cry, giant crocodile tears, in absolute terror in the back seat, found this to be highly amusing. I love my parents. Living with this little story has taken
many fucking years of therapy
to get over, but most importantly, it taught me an important life lesson. Vet your stories, find their conflicts of interest, and most of all, third-party verification. There was never a Fred. I had been lied to. At least, I'm pretty sure I was lied to, because every so often I kind of secretly expect to hear a news report of a bear man found living in the Great Smoky Mountain National Forest. This sad but entirely true story brings me to this week's topic, admittedly in a pretty non-sequitur way: the after effects of Y2K in the finale of the For the Winter series for 2025. Because Y2K was the first time the internet had actively made the world worse, and we're all living in the world that Y2K created. So buckle up and let's talk about the wet legacy of Tu Y2K. L.P. Hartley wrote in his 1953 novel, The Go-Between, quote, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there," unquote. And that's a pretty useful idea for a layperson to keep in mind when they start to think about history.
They never do.
This is a lot easier to do when you're talking to like a century or so. Less easy when you're talking about the entire lifespan of a 25-year-old TikTok influencer. One of the reasons this podcast exists.
My ego.
Your poor spotted ego.
No. I mean, okay, yes, but no. It exists to remind the listeners that the world we lived in when the things I discussed happened is now a foreign country. And the country we live in now is because those things happen for better and usually for the worse. I'm going to reference something called a monoculture a lot over the next few minutes, and it essentially means that there's one dominant culture in a society. And I got to say that it was pretty great if you were in that dominant social group, which I was, and indeed am. The problem with it was that it left a lot of people out. There was very, very little representation in the monoculture for anyone darker skinned than a avid sunbather. And though it was getting better through the 70s and 80s. Now, the monoculture certainly didn't include anyone whose romantic or sexual behaviors drifted from the rigidly heterosexual, and it didn't welcome eccentrics, dreamers, the troubled souls searching for meaning and all the stifling conformity of the time. Those folks, along with the homosexuals, were forced to the edges of society into enclaves and cities, which became these islands of color in the drab beige of American society. The monoculture was deeply flawed, inherently racist, and frighteningly homophobic. But it could change, because it had changed by the 90s. What it meant to be an American now had room for women and African Americans. And increasingly, it had space for diversity of immigrant populations and slowly, far too slowly, homosexuality. And for decades, the monoculture had been this iron dome keeping those others out. But by the early 90s, it was just beginning to become an umbrella that was slowly spreading to shelter more and more people beneath it. And because of this, it had reached the point where this monoculture was either going to adapt and truly become inclusive or disintegrate completely. It was never going to be perfect. But had things turned just slightly, it might have been enough to hold everything together. Unfortunately for us all, I think we all know how that turned out. By the late 90s, however, all the things that we now recognize as the frames of our current problem were fully erect. That monoculture that was American life was beginning to fragment. Folks from the fringes were filtering in towards the center, and in response, some folks who had been in the center began to leave for the fringe. No one forced them out. They left of their own free will because they didn't like the people who were now being normalized. It had been a remarkably resilient institution. It was born in the post-war boom of the 1950s, survived the turmoil of the 60s, the malaise of the 70s, the frenetic fuck you, I got mine of the 80s. America still coalesced around basically the same information and entertainment delivery system that was network television.
The most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite.
And by the 90s, as cable television rose to prominence and the news media boomed in print, more and more information than ever before was available for Americans to consume, and they could pick and choose what they consumed. There had always been a fringe ecosystem for the news.
Hey, Mom, I find it interesting that you refer to the Weekly World News as the paper. The paper contains facts.
But with so much money flowing in and everyone competing for eyeballs on their content, the demand elevated some of these fringe media groups to a certain legitimacy, and things that previously had been accepted as facts now became negotiable. And because of this negotiability, certain groups who had long felt their own brands of facts ignored, largely because their brands of facts were
You really are batshit crazy.
became empowered, and conspiracy theories blossomed. Prior to the 90s, most conspiracy theories were political, but not necessarily partisan. Democrats and Republicans could share a belief in the Kennedy assassination or moon landings or the Illuminati. Their conclusions might be different, but they shared the same feeling that someone did something. But in the 90s, the partisan divide began to widen. Again, not in the content, because they still believed in things like
the concept of a new world order has been around since Woodrow Wilson, but George Bush's 1990 speech roused conspiracy theorists on both sides of the spectrum.
And their conclusions were now way further apart because the right began to draw crazier and crazier conclusions, many of which we've discussed over the years of this podcast. The election of William Jefferson Clinton was a flashpoint where these insane theories began to creep deeper into mainstream politics. One of the earliest Clinton theories was that Bill and Hillary had as many as 50 people murdered in Arkansas for reasons. There was this bizarre documentary that was made and promoted by people like Jerry Falwell on his Bible show. It's actually still quite popular today, despite being debunked endlessly over the past 35 years. And it's referenced by people like Christopher Ruddy, the founder and owner of Newsmax, of course, the Cheeto-in-Chief, and Marjorie Taylor Greene.
See you next Tuesday then. Yeah.
When the GOP had a landslide victory in 94 in the House and Senate, and Speaker Newt Gingrich happily winked and nodded to the peddlers of this bullshit as he shifted how the business of Washington was done into an ever deeper morass of partisan shit wallowing that we all still live with today. But even still, those theories remained fringe, maligned, and even humorous because the monoculture was still holding us together. But its inertial mass was weakening, and sooner or later, the center just simply could not hold. There was no single moment when reality became debatable until around
somewhere around Y2K.
It had all the things a truly great conspiracy theory needs. A worldwide problem that few people actually understood, and the people who did understood it spoke in a language that people really didn't understand. Only 26% of U.S. households had a computer in 1999, and about half of those had any kind of internet access. And also the people who had computers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, well, quote, households with the highest level of education had the highest level of computer ownership. In 97, 66% of those households whose reference person had attended graduate school owned a computer, compared with less than 12% of those headed by a person who did not graduate from high school, unquote. Computers were expensive toys in 1999, and so the average working class American understood very little about them unless they used them in their jobs, and even then, they probably just knew what buttons to push. Look, it's 25 years later. I still don't understand computers. I just know what buttons to push. And in the 90s, a lot of working classes Americans were worried that computers were going to take their jobs the way that, white-collar Americans are worried that AI will take ours today. So this was a massive problem. A problem in which in walked the new media because they saw that they could.
You were going to make so much money.
And stoked all the unfamiliarity and strangeness into a panic in the least informed people. Still, as we've seen, the monoculture rallied one more time and tamped down the rhetoric and amped up the solutions, and nothing happened.
That's a good thing.
right?
Yeah, well, we'll see about that. As the turn of millennium turned, we had a fracturing culture, an increasingly bitter partisan divide, and a deepening distrust in the media. Because Y2K ended with a lot of people not entirely sure what it was in the first place, it left a lot of people asking,
What else don't I know?
And right after that, computers got cheaper and the internet more readily available, and they turned to this information superhighway for information. Information provided by people they did not know and lacking any sort of critical thinking education, thanks to our old friend Ronald Reagan's
He said it!
education cuts. They just simply assumed that this information was correct and true because it already appealed to what they wanted to believe. And to be clear, this has always been the case in America and the world. Propaganda, yellow journalism, even good old-fashioned rumor mill has haunted humanity for most of our existence. But starting in the late 90s and into the early aughts, the internet began to,
Prepare ship for ludicrous speed.
Most of my listeners were around for those heady days of Web 1.0 when websites were still on GeoCities, Google was still just a baby search engine, and the most common way to communicate was an AOL instant messenger window and a bulletin board site. What was a bulletin board site? Well, you sat down, opened up your Netscape navigator, and began researching, and a little while later...
Ask Jeeves told me.
...that http://grassy knolls, spelled N-O-L-E-S, 11263, because that was JFK's assassination date, historical fact, HICTORIC 4L, factz.geocities.com says
What I had heard was
that aliens were real. They didn't kill JFK, but merely came to take him back to his home planet to be tried on charges of treason. Oh, and also,
we have 2 UFOs in a warehouse and we put JFK's brain in a monkey.
This would be followed by 400 comment thread where various dudes, and they were almost always dude, called Grassy Knolls a CIA plant because they knew for a fact that JFK was alive and well at our secret moon base, or that he and Bobby were both alive and well and had hostage in a Vatican vault along with Marilyn Monroe, who was being cloned, and one of her clones was actually Princess Diana. Only to learn in the next comment that the person who said that was just an MI6 plant because everyone knew that the Queen had ordered Di's assassination on behalf of the Illuminati. What I'm trying to say is you had to work in the early days of the internet to find crazy shit to believe. I mean, it was work, but it wasn't as hard work as before the internet when you had to talk to a guy who was naked wearing only a sandwich board in the back of your local Denny's. The early internet walked their way to ludicrous speed so that social media could come along and take our bullshit far beyond ludicrous and straight into...
They've gone to plaid.
But more than introducing an ever-accelerating bullshit stream into the collective brains of Americans, the very fact that Y2K was such an overwhelming success did an unimaginable level of damage. Maybe more than if we never fixed it in the first place.
How does that work?
Speaking broadly, in about half the population, it made them think that the whole thing was a hoax in the first place. And in the other half of the population, it made them think that anything could be fixed by technology. So either the big, terrible thing that is about to happen is a lie, told by those who want you to stop rolling coal in your diesel truck, or the problem can be fixed if we just throw enough money and brains in it, and it doesn't require us to sacrifice anything to make it happen. The writer Lisa Vox wrote about this phenomenon in Process, a blog for American history, back in 2020. Quote, 20 years later, Y2K may be remembered as a non-event, but it set the stage for how Americans would talk about threats such as climate change and terrorism. Observers of Y2K bemoan the short-sightedness of humanity, a criticism that has become louder since. The chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation argued in 2011 that short-termism contributed to the Great Recession, and it has become de rigueur for the environmentally aware to point to the human incapacity for long-term planning as a cause for climate change and inaction, unquote. Because back then, Al Gore was telling us 20 years ago that shit was getting bad and big changes need to be made right now, or the world would be...
like the truly, deeply fucked.
The right called him a liar, and the left hand-waved it all away with a magical tech solution that would appear and save us all at the last minute. Admit it, y'all kind of still think that's what's going to happen, don't you? Deep down in your heart, you kind of think that things will probably be bad for a little while, but some carbon-sucking technology will just come along and Bruce Willis and his gang of roughnecks will save us.
What is up with you in that movie?
I don't honestly know. What I do know is there's no magic machine in the works Nothing that's going to help us, not even
Mega Maid.
I also don't know why I'm so obsessed with Spaceballs right now either. The reason you kind of believe that there's some magical solution is that 25 years ago, the world was ending, and it didn't end because some nerds worked really hard, and that made you think that nerds working really hard could kind of fix anything. Yet on the other side, though, the magical optimism is magical pessimism, and it's equally pernicious. More from Process. Quote, though Y2K didn't spawn any religious movements, some Y2K doomsayers merely concluded that the apocalypse had just been postponed. A number of Y2K diehards insisted in the early days of January that the danger hadn't passed, while others with pre-existing apocalyptic beliefs contended that Y2K had been a dress rehearsal for the real thing. The latter group included conservative evangelicals who subscribed to premillennialist beliefs. Conservative evangelicals Jerry Falwell, Chuck Missler, Grant Jessery argued that Y2K would set the stage for the second coming of Jesus Christ, and when that didn't happen, no one abandoned their beliefs. When an apocalyptic prophecy fails to materialize, many believers in that prophecy actually find their faith strengthened. Disinformation can cause members of a group to renew their faith and try to expand their membership as a way of coping with cognitive dissonance. The tension between expecting the apocalypse and going on with everyday life has been present in Christianity since its inception, and in that sense, the threat of Y2K was more important than its failure to incite disaster, unquote. And you have to admit that the things that have happened since Y2K, well, they haven't made this atheist think that Jesus is coming back because no Jesus, but I also can't rule out the possibility of an apocalypse. Terrorism, economic collapse, pandemic, Trump times 2. I don't know. Maybe those fuckers are onto something. And look, I'm not saying that it would have been better if Y2K had been a world-altering disaster. What I'm saying is that it might have been better if Y2K had been kind of a world-altering clusterfuck. Like, maybe the lights had gone out a couple of days. What if things got a little bad for a little while, if such a thing is even possible, and then they got better? A little apocalypse is a treat to show people how bad things would get, if we didn't all get together and fix shit. Because look, we do that. When there is a natural disaster, you see the best in humanity. People turn out to help their neighbors, pull in for floodwaters, or try to save their neighborhood from a wildfire with a goddamn garden hose. They stick around and help them recover and then rebuild. It's not a fluke. It happens all the time because humanity is at its best when something bigger than they are reminds them of how hard it is out there. And if it happened when there was just enough of that monoculture around to remind them that we're all part of something bigger than us individually, then maybe we might not be so,
fucked up beyond all recognition.
Today. And now, a quarter of a century past the events of Y2K, that very thing that honestly we worked so hard to save has become kind of the instrument of our undoing. The wedge that drives us further and further into our own tribes with our own sources of information, our own reality. The legacy of all the work of the late 90s is not a one world order. It is hundreds, thousands of worlds in competition with each other. In an odd way, we did become those survivors in the desert compounds predicted by Y2K doomers, protecting what is ours and keeping outsiders at bay. We no longer agree on what's true, no longer trust anyone but those who agree with our politics to explain anything. And I'm unsure whether it would have been better or worse if the lights had gone out. I don't know. All of this is probably just me rambling. I'm an old man missing his home country, not really comfortable in the world, in the country, the time that he lives in today. Maybe I'm like a sad little boy who's forced to go and live with the bears in the Great Smoky Mountains because he just wouldn't go to bed on time. So wherever you are, brother, this one's for you, Fred.
Who swings a golf club like a dream. I'd like to try to qualify him for the U.S. Amateurs.
Coming to Apple TV Plus.
What's your name?
I'm not into older guys, but I'm flattered.
A new comedy series, Stick.
I don't want to go on this trip.
Your mouth's saying one thing, but those eyes are saying something else.
From the home of Ted Lasso.
This is your shot at redemption? This is your mulligan?
Owen Wilson.
This game takes and it takes. The game's finally giving me something back.
Stick.
You know Arnold Palmer?
Iced tea, lemonade, mix it.
I'm missing a nap for this.
Streaming June 4th on Apple TV Plus.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for this day.
That is it for the show this week and for Winter Series 2025. Thank God. I admit this was a strange ending, and I was never exactly sure how to wind everything up. I could have stretched some stories, dug deep into the work that went into fixing Y2K. That was the original plan, but the world happened, and I felt that I had something to say about what happened, but didn't want to say it about the world that was happening. It's a complicated time for us all. Still, the show must go on, and Pod Friends it shall. Next month looks to be a lot more fun. This is not properly a series, but the Celtic Kings Network is getting all into Valentine's for some reason.
Stupid Hallmark holiday anyway.
So I figured out why not go with the flow, and all of February we will be talking about love and
how stupid it is.
So you're going to come back for that. If you want to know all the big doings at CelticKings.com, you should head over to CelticKings.com and sign up for our newsletter. Oh, it's got all the latest show updates, Gavin's advice for the lovelorn, and so very much more. You should rate us and review us and share us on your social media if you have any social media left after your purge. And as always, if you want to kick us a buck so we can spend it on a Valentine card to the other shows, hit us up at patreon.com/whatthehellpodcast. Do all the things Jeremy tells you to do in the closing credits, otherwise we will not be getting those chalky hearts with stupid sayings on them this year. So really, they don't put a lot of money into Valentine's Day. And so for me, Dave, can't get no sleeves for my records nor laces for my shoes. Bledsoe, producer.
I can get no fancy notes on my blue guitar. God, strings is amazing.
Gavin and all the fictional fractured cultures on the show, we want to say we just can't find a way not to be one world in disharmony. And we'll see you all next week.
What the Hell Were You Thinking stars Dave Bledsoe and features Gavin St. James and several fictional minions. The show is produced by Kimberly Steele and a part of the Seltzer Kings podcast network. You can find more information on the show on their website, whatthehellpodcast.com, or on Twitter at @thehell_podcast, or on Facebook as What the Hell Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I have no ending for this, so I take a small bow.
What about Fabio?
Seltzer Kings
Podcasts.